Good morning, everyone. I am Derek Wallace, Vice President of Marketing for the LoRa Alliance, and I'm really happy to be here with you today to moderate today's panel discussion on smart buildings to smart cities. Just a little bit about me. I am, as I said, the Vice President of Marketing for the LoRa Alliance. The LoRa Alliance is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to developing and maintaining the open LoRaWAN standard. LoRaWAN is a wireless communication protocol designed specifically to enable IoT use cases within the LPWAN, which stands for Low Power Wide Area Networking arena. It is globally deployed. It is really just a fantastic communication tool within IoT. But, and also, LoRaWAN is deployed in many different verticals around the world, and in particular, and very relevant for today's discussion, in smart buildings to smart cities. So second, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. So you, the audience, you're gonna hear some great information from our fantastic panelists, and also to our panelists for taking the time to prepare and join in today's discussion. Now, for those of you, just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded and available for viewing later for those of you who are not able to attend, or if you would like to share it with your colleagues to be able to hear this fantastic information. And then for those of you who are with us today, we are going to have a question and answer session at the end of this webinar. So get your questions ready. And in fact, as you think of them, type them in the Q&A section of your Zoom interface at the bottom there, and then we'll sift through them and then delegate them out to our panelists to answer your questions. Okay, moving on with the show, I would really love to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to do that by having them briefly introduce themselves. So Brenda, let's start off with you.
Thank you very much, Derek. So I'm Brenda Beckedorf. I'm the Executive Director for Alberta IoT and the Regional Director for AIoT Canada. Both nonprofits have a focus on being the voice of the IoT community for government, for building awareness of the growing IoT sector, both in Alberta and in Canada, and opening doors for our companies to the national and international market. So excited to be here today. Both PCL and Eddy Solutions are heavily involved with Alberta IoT, and I'm excited to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda, and welcome aboard. And John, let's go over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Derek, and thanks for having me this morning, and excited to be here as well. My name is John Boktor, Senior Manager, Digital Construction, working for our corporate office from Edmonton, but I'm actually based in Toronto here, and I work through the corporate technology group. It is a pretty large group, over 100 people that both software develop and support technology adoption and software development throughout the company, as PCL is one of the largest contractors in North America. Of course, it takes a lot of heavy lifting to go through all that. So I'm happy to be part of that group, and my group focuses on implementation of new technology such as IoT-based sensors, field applications, even some of the new initiatives like robotics, and also existing technology that are in-house or from an external perspective as well. And the focus is to really ensure operationalizing them in the field and to gain adoption throughout our digital change within the company. So that's a little bit about me, and yeah, thanks for having me here again.
Great, thank you very much, John, and welcome to you as well. Bryan, over to you.
Thanks, Derek. Great to be here with everyone today. Appreciate the time. My name is Bryan Witkowski, based in Philadelphia at Comcast headquarters, and I lead strategy and was a co-founder of MachineQ. We're a business created to help partners deploy and manage IoT solutions at scale. So we kind of have a unique role in the IoT market where we're not building management experts, but we sit in the middle and work with partners like Eddy, who have a unique piece of hardware on one side, a solution on the other, all the challenging stuff in the middle that lots of people don't want to do. We specialize in that and help our partners scale. So we have a unique kind of view on the market. As Derek mentioned, we're also involved in LoRaWAN, which we think is really applicable to the smart building technology. It really makes it easy to deploy and manage devices as cheaply as possible, meaning you can deploy lots of solutions and have a quick ROI. We're seeing lots of innovation and interesting use cases out there. So excited to talk about those and hear from the rest of the panel.
Great. Thank you very much, Bryan, and very good to see you again as well. As Bryan said, they work with LoRa, so I definitely get the chance to work with him. And let's go over to Sam.
Great, thanks, Derek. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Reid. I'm the sales manager here at Eddy Solutions, responsible for our channel partnership program. So I work with many of our technology partners, including Bryan at MachineQ. I've been with Eddy for about a year, but been working in the IoT space for the last 4 years and in technology sales for the last 20. So excited to be part of this panel as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Sam. And thank you all of our panelists. It's really pleased that you're able to join us today. And again, for taking the time to prepare for today and then join today. Let's go ahead and start off with the first question for today's discussion. It's kind of a big one, so we'll break it down a little bit. The evolution of smart buildings is such a big topic. So let's start a little bit simpler, perhaps even at the beginning. So Bryan, I'd like to give this one to you. Why don't you start us off here in terms of the technology and how it all began?
Thanks, Derek. I'm stoked to give a history lesson here to probably an audience that knows infinitely more about the subject than me, but I'll start maybe a little simpler. You know, I've been in connected technologies for my entire career. I would say I really got started in wireless IoT 7 years ago. And when we first moved into this space at Comcast, was saying, you know, how is this relevant to buildings and try to get smart what they're doing today? And if you look at the history of connected devices, when I started, it was, you know, standard BMS. There's a server room in one of the back offices, and everything was hardwired. And in one of the first buildings we worked in, to get a new device deployed, it was, you know, contact union labor, spend $300 with an electrician, and then, you know, after a lot of, you know, work and connectivity, you'd have a hardwired asset there that had to be, you know, mains powered or, you know, extremely difficult to install. And then we tried to, you know, think through with some of those building leaders, you know, how could wireless change their business? There's a lot of resistance, like, is this reliable? Is it secure? You know, how is this scalable? So I think, you know, in my journey, you know, that, you know, kind of played out over a period of years, but I think we're well past that point. I think, you know, from, you know, the most complex Class A real estate to, you know, old brownfield buildings, I think there's acknowledgement that IoT is transformational, and we're past that kind of dip in the market, or that belief that this isn't scalable. I think that there's a huge amount of opportunity, and it's a very complex space, so there's lots of opportunity. And again, the fact that, you know, we have solution providers that have come up with really creative things that have demonstrable ROI, the fact that there's standards bodies like LoRa Alliance that have really progressed kind of the sense of security that these technologies are in for the long haul. There's not the usual VHS or Betamax kind of debate going on. There is some standardization that gives more confidence. And again, all the changes we're seeing driven by the pandemic are really increasing the need to deploy these technologies and do it quickly and at scale. So I think it's a great time to be in the space, and I think the growth we'll see in the next 2 years is going to be immense.
Thanks, Bryan. You actually made me smile and brought back nightmares from the 90s and dealing with all the wired and getting permissions to get anything done in the building. Yeah, and I'm still smiling. Sam, would you like to add to that from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Yeah, definitely. When I started my career 20 years ago with a security company installing security card access video systems, I can relate right back to the challenges that we faced with wired systems. You know, the evolution of wireless has enabled, you know, a lot more flexibility, you know, and ease of implementation now that, you know, we don't have those restrictions anymore. And then with the kind of evolution of wireless platforms like LoRa and LoRaWAN, you know, it's something that has really helped to solidify the marketplace and, you know, make it more adoptable for, you know, clients today.
Great. Love whenever people talk about LoRaWAN, so thanks for that as well. John, how about, you know, from the construction perspective, anything you'd like to add on this?
No, you know what? It's great to hear more of the technology side of where things like IoT and other tech is at, because it's matured a lot more than 2 years ago if you'd asked that same question. So from our perspective, the more mature it is, whether it's things like LoRaWAN specifically on that topic, or, you know, just in general, whether it's vision learning from cameras or, you know, robotics or whatever it might be, these things are maturing so much now that we're able to actually see it in the field, and the adoption is increasing because of that reality that things are getting better and better. And so to me, when our field staff see the maturity or can feel the maturity, they're easily more engaged and easily more like, you know what, this can get done. I can actually use this, because they're very focused on their projects, and they're very focused on this has to work, and has to work right, and has to work all the time. And so more now that we're adopting, we're seeing actually the idea that, hey, these technologies are actually working, they're working properly, they're working all the time, and now I can actually use them for whatever part of my job. So maybe that's just a little bit on the construction side of it.
That's actually really interesting because it's like real world with people out there using it. So to hear that, also the other thing that you said, for a change just within 2 years, you said, the question would have been answered differently from your perspective 2 years ago. So it is rather amazing, some of us talking about, 20, 30 years ago, and even just within 2 years, a big change. Thank you very much for that. Now, Brenda, you're going to lead off on the next question, but is there anything that you want to add to this one?
No, I think the next question probably is a good fit for me.
Well, that's great, because we'll just go right to the next question. We want to make sure all our panelists are happy and comfortable and able to share their expertise and thoughts. So it's all about the team here. Okay, so here is question 2. Now, remember, everyone, if you have questions, definitely make sure to put them in the Q&A to get even more of our expertise from our panelists. Okay, Brenda, we have a question here on what are we seeing in terms of the market drivers for IoT? Now, Brenda, you have quite a lot of insight here in terms of seeing the need from an innovator perspective, and also just, from what I've learned in the last week, what you do and who you represent in Alberta. So why don't you start us off with that?
Well, and it's interesting. So we work with, in Alberta, probably a couple hundred SMEs and growing technology companies. And I would say probably at least 40% of them are in the smart building sector. And we're watching them and what they're telling us as an organization. And I think the biggest thing we're hearing is around improved tenant relationships, building operations. Alberta's interesting and Calgary's interesting because we have such a high vacancy rate. And I think others on this panel have mentioned that they're also seeing it where they are. So how do we turn around and bring people back into the building and make sure that they feel safe? But at the same time, we're also looking at the fact that a lot of our buildings are not smart buildings yet. And how do we turn around and do that switch? And what is the cost to it? And we're also hearing that if you're sub 50,000, is that cost able to be handled by the business owner? So there's a lot of question around this. And I think the next year is going to be very interesting, especially in Alberta. But I'd love to hear also too from other parts of Canada, how they're finding that impact.
Great, thank you, John. And everyone, my infamous cat is saying hi to you all as well. So apologies for that. So John, would you like to add to this from again, your construction perspective?
Yeah, to kind of add to Brenda's perspective. So I'll get to the client side or client from our client side in the construction space. But I think I would even take this a little further in terms of what we're seeing in the ESG space or things like net zero and LEED and WELL programs, especially in the Toronto or Ontario market. Like, in my opinion, from an IoT, because we're talking IoT, if you're going to get to net zero or carbon neutral or, things of that sustainable building perspective, you need to measure it. You're going to eventually have to get to a point where you're measuring it. And to sustain that measuring aspect and to collect the data from all these measurements, IoT is going to play a really important part because it's versatile, it's easy to adapt, it's easy to change, it's easy to install and deploy. And so if you want to measure your success in that space, whether it's ESG or net zero and so on, as a client or even as a builder, you're going to have to somewhat deploy some sort of IoT device-based infrastructure within your buildings. And that's going to get us to that next stage. But to Brenda's point, if you're talking about smart building, for us, for our perspective in PCL, we started, how do we look at it from a smart construction perspective? How do we start right from the beginning of the construction or even design process in a building, right? I think you need to start from that beginning stage now and we're seeing more and more of our clients look at it from the beginning. And so now you're seeing IoT becoming a conversation piece, right, from the start of design into construction, into post-construction. Things like, clear visibility in a building. A lot of our clients, even our own staff, want to, as they see more of that technology, they're like, I want to know more. I want to get more data. I want to be able to measure more, right? So, and clear visibility is another aspect I think is in that space. And then acceleration, of course, because of COVID, right? As we digitize more and more, IT again plays a really important part to see that digitization happen in our space. So, we work heavily with Latium Technologies and the Job Site Insights platform to bring that to light, to bring that understanding. And our people have been able to adapt such technology really quickly because it is seeing that visibility, understanding COVID concerns, right? Whether it's screening of workers or understanding space utilization and occupancy. So all those, I think, are playing a really critical part of the IT sector.
That's really interesting. What a great answer and great insight, and especially from the beginning, it kind of reminds me of security. Security used to be an afterthought, and for years now, anyone who's in this space knows you got to design security in the very beginning. And what you're telling us is you got to start with construction as you're planning it before you get anywhere near building it. So really, really interesting insight. Sam or Bryan, is there anything that you would like to add?
Sure. I just say the other side of the market. I'm sorry, Sam. I'll go quick. The other side of the market that Brenda alluded to is there's two factors. One, the opportunity to connect buildings that aren't connected today is immense. I mean, huge opportunity. You couple that with the vacancy rate, the pandemic challenges, those two market forces are coming together, driving a lot of near-term decision making. You couple that with the benefits of IoT, how much easier it is to get started in terms of deployment, cost, hardware. And then you look at creativity and pricing models. So leasing models as opposed to a huge hardware expense up front. You look at the work that Eddy is doing in terms of working with insurance companies to subsidize the whole cost. All those factors are coming together and just making the buying decision so much simpler for a building owner. So I think we'll see immense growth in brownfield IoT solutions. And they don't need to be the super complex nuts and bolts BMS. It can solve things like occupancy, air quality, water management, and I think we'll see that accelerate, and that opens the field up to more and more smaller companies as opposed to the biggest players at the top, the Siemens and Trains of the world.
Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. So just to kind of echo what Brenda was saying about occupancy, we're not seeing that, just in Ontario, but I support, partners all across North America, and definitely occupancy is, a significant challenge. And how do, building owners and management companies keep their eyes on their properties when they don't have as many people in there physically? So, that's one aspect. The other aspect was covered quite heavily in the last panel with the insurance, aspect as well. Where they have either driving premiums and deductibles as a result, or in some cases they may not be able to get insured if they don't have certain technologies implemented to secure their properties.
Great, thank you very much for that, Sam. And actually, I'm going to have you kick us off on our next question. Another, really interesting question is, what about the roadblocks to faster adoption? So, Sam, let's go ahead and start with you as an innovation supplier.
Yeah, thanks. So there's still a significant number of roadblocks. I think one of the major ones is just the fragmentation that still exists within the ecosystem. There are a lot of great technologies out there that are, that make it uncertain for buyers about which ones to kind of leverage and where do they start, and then which ones are going to be viable long term as well. So it really brings a lot of market confusion about, which ones they feel they should be adopting, to move forward with as their, as their product of choice. So I think that's really probably one of the major roadblocks that we've seen today.
That's great, and it's something that we spend a lot of time answering with LoRa. And one thing I think that really does help is a strong and big and vibrant ecosystem within whatever technology that you're choosing, because then you don't have vendor lock-in, and you have choice, and you have innovation, you have drive down costs, and also having such a large ecosystem really shows the commitment to others and their belief in that technology being around long term. And we just happen to have at the LoRa Alliance, with LoRa WAN, a tremendously large ecosystem. So I wanted to get that plug in because it's true and very important. But Bryan, would you like to add insight to this?
Yeah, two points. First, Sam, spot on with fragmentation. I think that's to what you alluded to, Derek. There's a lot less concern that we run into on the wireless side. Before that, it was always like, where does my data live, and where is the application? Is that data where what public cloud is it in versus a BMS versus a siloed application? I think we've seen that barrier brought down a bit further too. I think people inherently believe that now if you can get the data, it's easier to move it around, and there's less concern that it has to live in this like very siloed, controlled environment. So they're more comfortable if it's in a public cloud versus an independent supplier's application. I think as IT groups get more sophisticated, more comfortable with IoT, that'll be less and less of a concern. The other one, the struggle that we always had, at the start of our IoT journey is like, prove to me that there's an ROI here. And thankfully now that, IoT has been in the market a few years, and a lot of the partners we work with, like Eddy, they have specific use cases they can point to. They have a very sophisticated way of calculating ROI based on the cost of the service and square footage. That has always been the biggest barrier to entry, because so many of these companies, they didn't have a discrete IoT or innovation budget. It's like, what can you solve for me? And if it's just a budget line item without a proven ROI, I can't make sense of it. But now that they see that there's a payback period and they can articulate it, they can prove it to the CFO, that's making the buying cycle go much more smoothly.
Absolutely. And Brenda, what are you seeing, from your SMEs or just in Alberta?
Well, and it's interesting. I think Bryan and Sam both touched on this. We have some very big players out there that understand what IoT and integration into a smart building looks like, and the measurable results out of it, the cost, everything. But if you're a smaller building owner, do you understand what IoT is going to do for you, what the cost is going to be, and what is the ROI long-term for it? And I think that might be a challenging area still. And so I think that educational component is still in there. I would also say that there's a lot of concern around cybersecurity and the data points with IoT in the smart buildings. So those areas, probably especially in the smaller builds, are especially the retrofit ones, that might be a bit more of a concern.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and I definitely have a comment on this topic as well. But John, is there anything you wanted to add?
Just something small. I think from a perspective of our industry, from a construction side, but also like from the client developer side, is standardization. I think there's still a real issue around standards and standardization within the tech space, within IoT. It's hard for an engineer, a design engineer, to put something down in paper. When we even talk about cybersecurity, like Brenda mentioned, what does that look like? And more clients and developers are still trying to figure out, how do I really put that in my specifications and to contract out to GCs and subcontractors and so on. So I think that in itself too will hopefully, in the next couple of years, we can see more of that kind of play out, the standardization, because that's really still a space that we're all trying to understand more and more. So
thanks, John. Very interesting. Yeah, standardization absolutely really does matter. It answers a lot of the questions that Sam brought up and others in this panel in terms of what's going to be here, what's a safe bet, what gives me the most option, flexibility, choice without being locked in or feeling like my investment isn't going to go anywhere. And then speaking of investment, really fantastic about the ROI comment. I got into IoT and, from M to M, really, I'd say the transition for me was about 2015, and so few people kind of knew what IoT was if you weren't really working in the space. So Brenda, your comment on the small, building owners, absolutely, IoT definitely has much more awareness than 6 years ago, but there's still education to be done, like you said, but it's definitely changed. And the other way it's changed significantly is the ROI, being able to show the comments that Sam and Bryan made in terms of, it's not just this project, it's not just this thing, it's not just this trend of IoT, where many projects, I just watched project after project after project fail for several years. And that's because people didn't have a clear idea what they were doing, what they wanted to achieve, and no way to measure the return on the investment. And now with the solutions like Eddy and what MachineQ, many of our members are doing, helping them see why this is important, how they're actually going to benefit from it. You know, our market, our industry has really come a long way. We still have a long way to go, but it's definitely a massive improvement compared to where we were even just 6 years ago. So thank you all very much for that. Now, very timely question here, and we would be remiss if we didn't talk about basically the pandemic and COVID-19 and how that's impacted smart buildings or the smart city appetite. So Bryan, why don't you go ahead and start us off here?
Sure. Thanks. Appreciate the intro on this. And I know there's another panel today touching on this, so hopefully I don't say anything contradicting what they're sharing. You know, at least in the US, like two like major themes, like, you know, first, and it was, I think, certainly done from a part of altruism, is like, how do we use IoT to help with contact tracing? And, you know, a lot of IoT specialist companies jumped on that in the US. I think it's safe to say that there's probably like mixed reception of that. And I think it was driven a lot by just personal concerns around data privacy and HIPAA regulations. So I don't think that's taken off in a big way, though. I think there's practical, applicable after effects of that in the market. There's other reasons that tool set is going to be relevant in compliance and worker safety. So the investment in that will be interesting to see that pay off. On the other side, the investment in air quality, hygiene, and IoT for that monitoring. You know, are we keeping the buildings clean? Are we properly circulating air or filters change? Like, it's. I don't think anyone could draw like a clear, you know, direct analogy between investment in IoT and the pandemic, but I think there's a sense from culturally and workers that this has to be invested in. So we're seeing lots of growth in those areas, and I think that'll continue without the pandemic, with hopefully the pandemic obviously trailing off. And the last, you know, occupancy again, is that there's with building return to work hybrid, there's going to be a need for more detective IoT controls that keep management of buildings in a way that was done previously through having workers on site. So I think, you know, those detective controls will continue to grow, and anyone that can kind of tie the detective controls in the environment to actually proactive preventive things, like in the case of Eddy, like detecting a leak, turning off the valves, you know, those are the solutions that I think will have the most momentum, you know, coming out of the worst parts of the pandemic.
Thanks, Bryan. And actually, it's a great lead into Eddy and to Sam. What's your take on this?
Yeah, so I actually joined Eddy, you know, right, you know, in the middle of the pandemic, kind of at the height of it. So at that time, obviously, we weren't going into the offices, but we've seen a continual acceleration of need for our product because of, you know, what I talked about earlier about not having as many physical eyes on the property. So, you know, before, you know, having you know, a leak in the washroom or a leaking riser, that was something that would be caught probably a little bit sooner, you know, with having someone on site more frequently. But now, because of that lack of occupancy, we're seeing that, you know, especially on the commercial side, that, you know, they're wanting to adopt these technologies to, you know, capture these data points a lot sooner, and, you know, continue to have their building secured and ready for when occupancy, you know, does increase again. And that's kind of trickled over to, you know, other properties like, you know, multifamily space, you know, where more people are there. But because the infrastructure is being used more, there's putting, you know, a significantly more strain on it than they anticipated. So yeah, it's kind of been a dual effect on both sides.
Thank you for that. And John, from perspectives from the construction side.
Yeah, you know, I'm probably going to take this a little different direction, you know, from my perspective, but clearly the pandemic has done something which, you know, as a person who's lived the digitalization or digital transformation in the company for the last couple of years, it's accelerated digitalization for sure. And we needed that, right? We needed some sort of, interesting enough, I see it as an opportunity. And the pandemic has done that. And you look at small businesses, go to a barbershop today or a hair salon. It's interesting how they had to adjust and change during the pandemic to get, you know, to go from a contactless business model in terms of, you know, people booking online and customers booking online and so on. Like that in itself has made a real change from a small business perspective, which, you know, to big companies as well. And from my, from a construction perspective, what we've seen too is connectivity, right? So areas within rural areas that need connectivity, we're starting to really hone on those issues that were not part of the discussion pre-pandemic. So I think things like, infrastructure connectivity, things like digitization of actual paper-based processes, contact tracing, all those kind of things that have really led to us understanding what the technology is going to be used for. I think that has really helped us understand the tech side more and more, and better ask questions too, right? Ask the right questions in that space. So, yeah.
Great, John, and thank you. And I love that you went in a different direction. I mean, that's the point of this diversity in our panel, is to really show the different areas so that we're sharing lots of information for everyone, but then there could be some topics that some people latch on more to because it's more relevant for where they are in their IoT journey. So thanks for that. And Brenda, anything you'd like to add to that?
I'll continue with the diversity of the conversation. To John's point, what we're seeing is almost an expectation from the employees going back into the building. They're now aware that we have ways to do contact tracing and to have sensors in place so that they don't have to touch things, and so that safety is there. So what I'm finding interesting is how many businesses are starting up in IoT that are because of the concerns around coming into a building and being safe, or that whole health aspect. And so it's interesting seeing how many companies had sensors in place that now are maybe pivoting a bit and using it to turn around and make a building safer to go to, and handle that concern that probably is there for the employees.
That's fantastic. And actually, my comments are, it's kind of a little bit of everything that you all are saying, that what we're seeing from the LoRa line. So, the safety and the pandemic. So John, you talked about the acceleration. I talked to analysts all over the world quite a lot, and they're all reporting about how COVID-19, slammed on the brakes for a while, but now we're really starting to see acceleration of IoT deployments. And that safety comment that you made, Brenda, and then combined with Bryan's earlier comment on, there are so many buildings out there that are ripe and ready and have the opportunity to be made smart. I actually gave a presentation on smart sustainable buildings in Amsterdam at the Broadband World Forum a couple of weeks ago, and I talked about the ESG, and someone brought up ESG earlier today as well, and how the ESG and this drive to make buildings go from green buildings to blue buildings, which is more encompassing about safety and about a positive work experience environment for people to come in. I think COVID, as people start returning, or even more importantly, as all of us as individuals start making choices about, do we go into the office? Do we go into that restaurant? Do we go into that public space? We're going to start looking at choice. And what was kind of a nice to have in smart sustainable buildings, and I think John talked about it, what he's seeing, and Sam as well, of this technology that people didn't really know about before. Now, if there are two buildings, if you're a building owner or a real estate management company responsible for getting people in and driving occupancy, you're going to have to prove and show that your building space is a safe, sustainable, comfortable place. So when people are making that choice, do I go to building A or building B? I'm going to go to the one that I feel much more comfortable. And I see that definitely driving decisions in the future as well, as entirely a result of the pandemic. So really, all of you, that's just diversity of thought, great content. This is a great session from my perspective. Okay, so we'll go on to our last question, I believe. Oh no, it's not our last question at all. So let's go to connectivity. And Bryan, we're going to start this off with you. So connectivity is often a major consideration, as is integration of disparate functions. What are your thoughts here?
I think we touched on this a bit across the panel so far, and I think it comes back again that now that IoT is known across the spectrum of the commercial real estate business, that the barriers to entry are much lower, and at the least standardization is driving a lot of that. my experience, and there's been many different kind of proprietary wireless technologies that have been there to kind of maybe confuse the market, confuse a less sophisticated buyer in the IoT space. But now that you've seen standardization and more market acceptance of those key technology, LoRa has certainly a role. Wi-Fi has always been there. BLE, Zigbee, RFID, there's relevance for all of those. I think that part of the conversation in terms of getting a new deployment or a new business launched is infinitely smaller than it was even 5 years ago. I think that that'll never go away. There's always going to be the security box to check, getting through the IT kind of scrutiny. But at the least, the people on the buying end of it are more comfortable, and folks like ourselves, Eddy, we're much better at answering those questions. And the LoRa Alliance has helped significantly on the LoRa standard side in terms of security. So I don't see that being a major impediment to growth. I think the other thing that's happened is the deployment of those networks has gotten so much more simpler. When you look at LoRa and some of the other mesh technologies, certainly it is a challenge to retrofit buildings. But if I take the LoRa example again, we're able to put one gateway in an IDF closet every 3 to 5 floors. It's not a sophisticated install. It doesn't require a lot of inside wiring. So we can get in there quickly. Part of the benefit of us being part of Comcast is we have a national deployment group that can deploy anywhere in the US. Obviously, we support Canada as well. So we can make that installation simple and just take one more piece of the complexity out and really focus the buying on decision, like what is the actual solution and what value is delivering. And again, we'll see the RF piece of that be less and less prominent in that sales motion and buying cycle.
Thanks for that, Bryan. Really interesting. Always good to hear about the power of LoRaWAN. And Sam, anything you'd like to add, especially like an integration of services here?
Yeah, so to Bryan's point earlier, there's a lot of different technologies that are available from a wireless perspective, and I think one of the great things that people are realizing is it's not a one size fits all. So while LoRaWAN does many things very well, there's times where cellular or Wi-Fi or BLE are the optimal route for that different platform. And with platforms that exist like JSI today, they're bringing these different solutions and different networking technologies together. Those are things that are going to help accelerate the adoption of different solutions as people move forward with integrating them into their buildings.
Fantastic. Now we're getting a bit on. So Brenda, just real quickly, is there anything that you wanted to add?
I would suggest that maybe one of the comments that needs to be addressed is on the rural areas and the lack of connectivity in those areas, because we're definitely hearing that pain point in Alberta. And it's an area that we're focused on and how we can turn around and help our small communities. So love some thoughts on that one.
Okay. Let's take this unexpected question posed to our group. Just throwing that little wild card there.
I am.
While people are thinking of thoughts, so you are meant to think about thoughts right now. John, anything you want to add from connectivity from the construction side, especially from some of the stuff you said earlier?
Yeah, I'll keep this kind of brief, but I think this space is extremely interesting. I've been blessed and lucky to actually work in this space heavily on the construction side, and there's clearly a necessity. There's a clear necessity, of course, from Brenda's comments on the rural side, but from a construction perspective, the more you digitize, the more you need some sort of connectivity, and so connectivity has become a real question as we deploy IoT devices, as we do model exchanges, 3D model exchanges in the cloud, as from a cloud service perspective, more field apps. All this stuff is making us realize that connectivity within our construction sites is becoming a real thing. It's no longer just this traditional, like, hey, connect the trailer and walk away, or connect the office and walk away. It's become kind of a real need. And I'm privileged to sit on the OGCA, the Ontario General Contracts Association, and it is a topic that comes across, and I've never seen anything more prevalent today than all our GCs in that space, whether small or big or medium size, all talking about connectivity. So having robustness in the connectivity is going to be still a bit of a lack. Ruggedness of rugged network gear is also important, because it's no longer just a thought post construction, but during construction. So all those little things that are happening in that space, so connectivity is becoming a real topic that it needs to be addressed as an industry, and I'm seeing more movement on it personally, but through the OGC is just as an example that we're seeing. So
thank you very much, John. You touched on the rural question that Brenda asked. Now, I actually have some thoughts on the connectivity in rural locations, but before I go ahead, Sam or Bryan, is there anything you want to say? I don't want to take the floor because you're actually our panelists. And if you don't, I'm happy to go.
All yours, Derek.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, so, it's interesting. And with LoRaWAN and LoRa Alliance, I mean, this is something that we see. We've had some partnerships or member companies who actually service specifically rural areas because of the difficulty of getting connectivity there. And this is where LoRaWAN is actually quite powerful. For one of the things that Bryan said, how easy it is to set up a LoRaWAN network, how you can easily support your first use case or application within buildings or whatever your IoT use case is. And often it's going to pay for itself with that first deployment, because you can cover quite a lot of sensors with a gateway that is pretty inexpensive, especially relative to some other technologies, and start enabling that. But then also with that very same network, you don't have to, you don't have to build a new network to enable more use cases. You can just layer new applications on that same LoRaWAN network, which is, really great. And it's good for someone who wants to start small and scale, which can be the case in rural locations. And I'm thinking farmers in particular. Another thing that's really good about LoRaWAN is the ability for private networks, because to your point, Brenda, sometimes in rural locations, you don't have connectivity or easy connectivity options. With LoRaWAN, what's great is that because of the private network capabilities, and because of how easy and cost effective it is to build and deploy and even manage the LoRaWAN network, or find partners that can manage it for you, you can build that LoRaWAN network exactly where you want, when you want it. And again, you can start small, you can start big if you want as well. But this really, I think, facilitates bringing connectivity, bringing IoT to those rural areas, because it actually makes it much easier. And with so many members within the LoRa Alliance globally, there are definitely partners that consumers can find to help them with their IoT journey within those rural spaces.
Just maybe Derek, just touch on a little bit of that too. The LoRa side is really critical, and it does help as what we all mentioned, and we're using it in PCL ourselves and our construction sites. But that backbone, I think that's what I was trying to mention. The backbone of that network is going to be critical, whether it's fiber, what's coming down the line in 5G. It's all those, the MachineQ, for example. You put the LTE, you put Wi-Fi. At the end of the day, that's what we're going to need to figure out as an industry, is what is that backbone that's going to, because that's going to impact design. It's going to impact how I'm going to construct it, how the developer is going to want to see it in the building. So again, I think that's another really critical part that is important for us, to continue thinking about too, in terms of that connectivity piece.
Absolutely. There's no one technology that's going to solve all the IoT use cases. Someone mentioned that. It's just true. And we see that with LoRaWAN. In fact, we have liaison relationships with other technologies, because LoRaWAN also plays really well and does combine actually with all those technologies that you mentioned as well. So as you're figuring out, as we all are figuring out, what the strategy is and how it's going to happen, LoRaWAN actually fits nicely with that. And even when you aren't ready yet, it still has a flexibility to help people get started, to get them on their IoT journey, and then have a nice path to once strategies are figured out. It sounded like a commercial for me, but actually it's really true, and it's something that we're really seeing globally. And in particular, it's just a really good fit for those rural areas who often are even further behind in their IoT journey than the other areas. Okay, any comments on that? Otherwise, I will move us on to the next question. Okay, all right, so now this is our last question before we take a couple of from the Q&A. So John, we're gonna have you start this off, which is, and everyone knows this, but it's a great question. What's your biggest piece of advice for companies approaching this world?
Yeah, to keep it simple, and Sam and Bryan touched on this in terms of the silo world that we live in terms of tech too, and then the different players in the industry. Because of that reason, because of the confusion and the startup movement, and also the amalgamation of companies and so on. To me, I think from a company, any company, my advice would be, looking back into technology adoption the last couple of years, is put a real plan together, put a real plan that can be then evaluated. I would even argue evaluated every 6 months to a year, not even more than that, just because of how things change so quickly in the technology industry. So I think putting a real plan that is actionable, that has real measurable actionable items, that still has that you can prosper with, and has aspiration, is important. To leave it to chance, or just to leave it to the market changes is not really a good thing to do. I think it's important just for every company to have a plan that is really, that is to the point, and addresses technology, whether you're answering to smart technology, smart building question, or IoT, or whatever it might be that you're answering, connectivity, infrastructure in your buildings. You have a portfolio of buildings that you're trying to have more IoT devices in. I think that's where you really need to ask the questions, and then put the plan towards it. So that's my advice.
Great advice. Planning before doing anything. Ask questions, plan multiple times before starting anything. Fantastic. And Brenda, over to you. What's your advice?
So I'm going to come from the educational point of view again, and I think it's educating and getting stakeholder buy-in into this whole going into a smart building and adding IoT. I think a lot of our leaders, and I'm going to go back to the smaller buildings, probably need to understand more about what it is that they're embarking on, the cost involved, measurables, and so forth. And I think it's really important for facility managers and the people at this table here, really, or this panel, need to be educating our building owners and executives so that they know what they're getting into. And I think attending events like this, being involved in organizations like ours, obviously, I think all of those are really important, because I think there's a lot of growing and change in this sector. And I think we need to turn around and keep that education going.
Thank you. Thank you very much. More great input. Sam, let's go over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I think kind of once you move past the the evaluation phase, you understand where you want to start. It's, picking a technology with the solution that can potentially be expanded on. If you pick a solution that's proprietary and standalone, as you look to expand on your smart building platform, you may find that initially you save money by picking this one solution, but then when you want to expand on it, you may have to invest in a whole new technology where, it may be more cost feasible to, spend a little bit more upfront on a technology that can be expanded on with, different solutions and integrated into other platforms. So, we work with MachineQ for leak detection, but, the great thing about working with them is they have other platforms to add on to. Same thing with JSI. So by providing those additional add-ons, you're going to have the ability to spread the cost out from a connectivity standpoint.
Thank you, Sam. And Bryan, would you like to finish us off with this one?
Sure. Just briefly, pick one solution and go with it. I mean, everyone's talked about pilot purgatory over the years, but picking a solution that has a clear ROI and is sufficiently simple. I mean, there's incredibly complex IoT solutions out there, but anything that will help the organization get started and kind of embrace like the cultural transformation that needs to happen across all the different functional groups. Like that's where we've seen the best success for large companies, is that they can pick one thing and start. Obviously, they have to prove the larger kind of like platform case and that there's multiple solutions, but getting that one rolling is the best way to unlock future progress.
Great. Thank you very much, Bryan. Thank you very much, everyone. And that's the last of our panelist questions, but we have a couple from the Q&A from you, the audience. We will go ahead and answer what we can within the time that we have left. So we're going to start off this first question with Sam, and it's a bit long, so I'm just going to read it. And then I think we'll start with Sam, and then we'll go to Bryan second. So Here's the question or comment. Great advances in wireless. Perception, however, is that you are safe for low data connectivity for non-critical services. Question, however, for designers. Is it still the case that if it is a critical service, wire it, especially with PoE++, where wired services can eliminate local power or battery challenges?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, from the Eddy side, we are considered a critical service for the buildings we're implemented in. And our insurance partners would definitely back us up on that. We are there to protect a building from, a significant water event and prevent, a significant loss. And, by leveraging, the LoRaWAN platform, we're no less secure, and I'd say we're actually more flexible, especially in the retrofit space, by leveraging LoRaWAN. So it's definitely not something that is something that should be reserved for non-critical services. And also from a security standpoint, there's many different layers of security that we build in to our solution to ensure that, the data is protected.
Thank you very much, Sam. Bryan.
Yeah, again, awesome question. Sam nailed it. They have a critical service. They use a wireless technology, and they've done it at scale, and it's proven. The supposition's spot on. I mean, the early days of IoT, it was not mission critical. There's actually like an FCC definition of that, and a lot of suppliers kind of will rule out that you can even use their product for anything like that. But beyond, Eddy's innovation, we've seen a number of other companies in fire suppression using it, worker safety. So I think that culturally, that's still a very challenging area. You have to be able to show redundancy at the device level, the network level, the cloud, the application, to make sure that if a critical event does occur, that every safety net is possibly there. But I think the market's really opened up on that. I think, again, that'll expand the TAM quite a bit for people with innovations in smart building.
Thank you very much for that, Bryan. And thank you, Sam and Bryan, for answering our first question. Now, we only have time for one more question. I've just been notified. We have a hard stop in 3 minutes. So before actually, John, I'm going to have you take this next question. So you probably only have about 2 minutes to answer it. Just want to thank everyone who's joined us. And a reminder, you can get this webinar on demand because it is being recorded. And then the next session does start at 1 p.m. And that is titled Environmental Social Governance and IoT, how prop tech investment bolsters ESG initiatives, a C-level discussion. So definitely don't leave us yet, but definitely join that. And so to close up, and yeah, John, I said you have 2 minutes for this question, and here it goes. Does anyone think there is going to be a general trend of repurposing large commercial spaces previously occupied by a single tenant, e.g., a large enterprise that had several floors of an office tower, to be suitable for many smaller enterprises involving redesign of HVAC distribution and control, electrical distribution, security, etc. And at what pace, e.g., equipment selection, construction, etc. That's a big one.
So I think it's going to be really hard to answer in 2 minutes. So thanks for the pressure there. And this is an important question. But just to highlight the overview of this question, so from a PCL perspective and a structure perspective, we are seeing this already happening. We are seeing the trend starting, and specifically in existing spaces. We are starting to get proposals and RPs come in from a perspective of, and our clients coming to us just asking to repurpose the space, whether that's because they're subleasing the space because of the impacts of COVID. But I would argue it's not necessarily that. I would argue that it's actually because of what we've spoken about the workers and employees wanting a space that is more hybrid focused. So like I can come in for a few days and leave, meaning the space is not necessarily full at 100% capacity all the time. So that is impacting things like HVAC systems, electrical distribution, and so on. What my argument here to be made is, yes, so there is a trend. The trend is going to accelerate, in my opinion, heavily. But when you're looking at technology like IoT, I would argue that you need to first before you change your systems, take a step of understanding your space and how you're going to change that space. before you start looking at the details on HVAC, wiring controls, control system security, access control, and so on. So that's where IoT and other technology comes into play to be able to tell you what the space is doing first before you start making those adjustments. I think you need that first now to be able to be versatile enough and to change it quickly for the purpose of the tenant. So yeah.
Thank you very much, John. Wow, I have pressure, but you nailed it. You got the pressure, a lot of information, a quick answer. We do need to go. So thank you to all of you for attending. Thank you, our panelists. Great session. All of you have a lovely, lovely day wherever you are at in the world. And make sure to join the next session at 1 p.m.
Thanks,
Very
everyone.
good, everyone.
Nice.